The genesis of this class for me was COVID, when suddenly, as a church, we were propelled into, at least for those first 6 weeks, everybody was on the same page, and then it quickly broke down, right? But for 6 weeks, everybody was on the same page of, okay, we're not going to meet together because we just don't know what we're up against here. Now what? And I realized in that season that we were making some decisions sort of intuitively about what technology was good for and what it wasn't, right? How we discerned what kinds of technology we were going to use and which ones we wouldn't. But it was very sort of implicit, very unintentional, very unstructured. And it really set me on a journey of, okay, I want to understand a framework, not just for right versus wrong. I think there are some places of right versus wrong in technology. I think more of what we're facing, though, here is a wisdom issue, is a discernment issue. What is the right use of this thing, and what is the wrong use of this thing? And how can we use it in such a way that we minimize the ways that we use it for flourishing and minimize the ways that it uses us, right? And so this content, this class really came out of this. In session one, this idea of the need for discernment and tools for discernment. I really think we're in a discernment zone. And I think we need tools for doing that, other than, well, I just spend this many minutes on my phone, or I don't look at anything bad on my phone, or et cetera, right? I think we need some deeper tools for that. Just so you guys know where I'm coming from on this, and these are some resources that I found really helpful. If you're not familiar with any of these, I encourage you. I've sent you all these slides if you signed up for the class, so you should have these. In terms of books, From the Garden to the City, by a man named Dyer. He was at least in charge of all the technological infrastructure at Dallas Seminary and did a phenomenal job writing a book on what is the gospel story of technology. We're going to be drawing a lot on this, from Genesis to Revelation, and how do we fit ourselves within that. That's a really good kind of theology book, if you will. Modern Technology and the Human Future talks a little bit more about AI, but also some of the ways that the digital technology that we're investing so much in is shifting and changing us. But two books that are extremely practical that I would encourage are Rinky, 12 Ways Your Phone is Changing You. Is anybody familiar with this book? Yeah. You might have told me about the book. It's quite possible. It's an excellent book. And then The TechWise Family by Andy Crouch. Does anybody know The TechWise Family? Oh man, go out and get that tomorrow, especially if you have kids. It is a fantastic book for diving into the practicalities of this. The other two thinkers, I would classify them, that aren't explicitly Christian, but just more of a philosophy of technology, are a guy named Tristan Harris. He used to work for Google. You can find some TED Talks by Tristan Harris. If you want to be freaked out, Tristan Harris is the person to go listen to. His experience at Google is utterly fascinating in this. And then Sherry Turkle, who also had TED Talks, has a book called Alone Together, has done a lot of research into how this is affecting youth. So those are some of the foundational resources that, as you guys follow up, as you look into this more from this, or even if you just want to know, okay, where's he getting this stuff from? It's really mainly from these resources. Okay, got an opening question to split up into two smaller groups for you guys to talk about. Is your smartphone mostly good, mostly bad, or is it morally neutral? AKA, does it just depend on how you use it? Mostly good, mostly bad, morally neutral. Break up. Spouses can't stay together. Sorry. And discuss. We'll come back in a few minutes. I need an answer and justification. Mostly good, mostly bad, or morally neutral? All right. Let's wrap up. I need definitive answers. Right now. Yeah. We can go home. We can go home, watch Super Bowl. Yeah, we can go home, watch Super Bowl. All right, I would love for if someone from each group could kind of sum up the general theme of the conversation and could do it in the mic so that people that are on the recording can follow along. But somebody from this group first. Sum up the general flow of your guys' conversation.
Let's see if I got this right. We landed on morally neutral because all technology can be used for good or for bad. But then on a deeper level, we discussed what are the slightly good ways that you can do, and also just the design of a phone in and of itself, like, gives a sense of pseudo community, actually creates walls, like it makes you think you're more connected, but you are a God in charge of all of your information. So in that sense, it is negative, but we landed on, but you can use it for good or for ill. So in that sense, it's morally neutral.
Yeah.
I guess I get to answer. So we also said morally neutral, maybe slightly bad. But we also talked about all the good things that you can get from it with navigation and communicating with people in Australia and, just lots of things. But it's very addictive, and it can be just a time sucker, and, and talking about not having a Sabbath because work is pinging you all the time, or all of those kinds of things. So there's a lot of negative, even if it's not like the really bad stuff that you could also get into, but morally neutral, because it is just a thing and we're the ones who are using it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, we have a good, like, morally reflective crew here, right? Because most of the time our attitudes to technology are summed up by what Douglas Adams, the guy who wrote Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, said. First, everything that's already in the world when you're born is just normal. Then anything that gets invented between then and before you turn 30 is incredibly exciting and creative, and with any luck, you can make a career out of it. And then finally, anything that gets invented after you're 30 is against the natural order of things, the beginning of the end of civilization as we know it, until it's been around for about 10 years when it gradually turns out to be okay. In general, those are the trends we come up against in terms of technology, right? There's this comfort level, this language of digital immigrants versus digital natives. That's a great question. Before the smartphone, yeah, I mean, Douglas Adams was writing for a long time. I don't know when in his career this came in, but definitely not like in the last 5 years. This isn't in, I don't think, Hitchhiker's Guide. He just wrote this. But usually our reaction to technology is based on our comfort level, right? Which comes from, are we immigrants or are we natives? I remember I would be an immigrant, right, to the digital world, even at my ripe old age of 38. But I remember in my house, my dad was always on the cutting edge of what the tech was. So when the Commodore 64 came out, anybody remember the Commodore 64? I got one of those in my room with the little, like, plug and play, like, games into it. So in terms of being an immigrant, I was an immigrant, but I was like fresh on the shores kind of immigrant. And so our family always had, even though we lived out in the country, this incredible openness to whatever the new technology was. Now, I've swung the pendulum back and forth on reaction to that or being open to that over the years, but I think we need more than just our kind of gut level reaction, right? Either the world's going to end or this is normal even, right? Some things that are normal might not be healthy for us, and some things that are brand new might be super useful. We need a better paradigm than what the kids are doing today. We need some discernment, right? Now, in order to discern, we need to have a better idea what it is that we're trying to navigate. Okay? Now, it's surprisingly tricky to come up with a definition of what technology is, especially a theological definition, but I like this one from John Dyer, who wrote from the Garden of the City. Technology is the human activity of using tools to transform God's creation for practical purposes. What do you notice in that definition? Human activity, right? This is something humans do. There are actually a couple situations in Scripture where God creates a technology, which is fascinating, or uses a technology, but primarily it's a human activity. Tools, right? Using tools to transform God's creation. That's right.
I think today when we say technology, we assume digital,
Yes.
electronic technology, something electronic,
Mm-hmm.
which is not mentioned there. So this is
Right. Right. Absolutely. That pen, that really cheap plastic pen that you're holding, is a technology, right? Technology is not just digital. We usually think now digital technology. But one of the things that was helpful for me in discernment around this was realizing, is there a story, is there discernment that applies to all different types of technology that might also be useful in the personal digital space? Like the printing press. We're going to talk about the printing press here in a minute. Absolutely. Revolutionary technology. We don't think of books as technology, but like they absolutely are, right? We use tools to transform God's creation for a practical purpose. Yeah. What else? Anything else you notice? Yeah, so Rick's saying the purposes are always practical. In one sense, yes. I do think what he's trying to differentiate here is the difference between art and technology. So art has a purpose, but it may be more reflective purpose, right? It may not be something that's immediately, like the Mona Lisa is not immediately practical for some task. And the way he's defining technology is we need this thing to do a thing, not just to reflect on a deeper level human aspirations or our sense of beauty or something like that. Technology can be beautiful, no doubt, but it has a purpose beyond just being beautiful or representing some deeper thing. Yeah. Right. Better, faster, easier, gooder. No. Oh, it's so good. Yes, transforming God's creation makes you a little leery of it. Like, what are you doing with what God made? That's where there's the story, the biblical story is going to come in here pretty strongly. And you're right to be leery, but also there is such a dignity in this that I think we're invited into, which is really, really cool. Okay. So that's the basic definition, the basic sense of, okay, what are we talking about when we talk about technology? We're getting it out of the realm of personal digital technology only. That's one part of a much bigger circle. And there's a theological component to this. We're taking God's creation, we're doing something with it, probably for good or ill. Marshall McLuhan was a kind of a cultural theorist, media theorist, technology theorist. And he talked about what technology ends up doing, and I think this is helpful. It extends and magnifies something that we do naturally. It eliminates or amputates something that we used to do. It often retrieves something from the past in modified form. And every technology has the possibility of reversing into a more negative behavior when it's overused or used outside the bounds of what it's meant to be. So let's think about like cars as a technology. Right? Cars extend or magnify something that we do naturally. Right? We can get places on our own, but cars greatly increase, extend, and magnify our ability to do that. It also eliminates or amputates something we used to do, right? Like walking. We don't do that anymore. It retrieves something from the past, right? We've always had other modes of getting around a little bit faster, whether it was riding on a horse or whether it was taking a train, just in the era before this. But it also has the possibility of reversing into a more negative behavior when it's overused or used wrongly. There are lots of different ways we could think about how cars have done that, okay? So what happens when we use a tool? Well, one, we shape the world, right? when we use a technology to transform God's creation, something is extended, something is magnified. And when you think about the big technological revolutions, let's just leave it to the last 500 years, 600 years. You see a couple different examples of this. One, as Rick pointed out, was the printing revolution. Right? It's hard to fathom life before the printing press. And the level of the extension of thought, the democratization, if you want to think about it that way, of many people's thoughts now being available to many, many, many people, right? It's no surprise that the Enlightenment movement, the focus on democracy, so many of the things that characterize the modern world came out of the revolution of the printing press. It was a technological revolution, but it transformed the ways that the world actually works. It extended, in one sense, our ability to think, right? In phenomenal ways. Absolutely. Wasn't disseminated beyond geography. It allowed ideas to be disseminated beyond geography and currency and money, because you had to have a lot of money to have access to these things, right? Before the printing revolution. Then you had the mechanical revolution coming in the 1650s and the 1850s, and that was all about extending our strength, right? Now we can do things that our bodies were limited before, and now we can do them in mass quantities. When you think about the Industrial Revolution in England, how that transformed that society. But it was this extension of strength such that we could make more than we ever could before. And that's the foundation of our modern economy, right? Then you got the digital revolution, and I say like proto-1850s to today, right? That extended the senses and minds, because the digital revolution really gathered together the revolutions that things like the phonograph and the photograph, it combined all of these earlier inventions and kind of put it all together. It extended our ability to sense things, to hear things, to see things, and extended our ability to be present to one another. One of the comments that Dyer makes is, before 1500, right at the time of the Reformation, if you had taken someone from that age, right before the printing press really gets going, and plopped them first into Abraham's day, and then next into our day in 2023, it would have had a lot more in common with Abraham's day, even though it was thousands of years removed, than they would have with our day. Even Abraham Lincoln, 1850s, way more in common with Abraham's day than our day. The amount of technological change, as you guys have referred to, the impact of these massive revolutions dwarfs anything that came in the 1500 years, right, or even beyond that before the printing revolution. These have been absolutely massive technological changes, and it's dramatically reoriented and reshaped our world. But the reality of technology is that it doesn't just shape one way, right? When we use a tool to change something, we also get changed. Right? Really easy example, take a shovel, you dig in a hole. You're shaping the earth with that shovel, but that shovel is also shaping you, right? You're getting blisters, you're getting biceps, you're not gonna be able to get out of the bed in the morning, right? That technology is shaping the world, but it's also in one sense kicking back and shaping us. Technology always kicks back and shapes us. Now, some people think it does this to a very minor degree. That would be a view of instrumentalism. It's just an instrument, and it shapes us, but not very much. Another view would be determinism, or once we use a tool, we immediately begin to lose our control of it, and it begins to control us. Truth is probably actually somewhere in the middle. The way I would phrase it is technology, whatever it is, always carries values with it. It always carries values. It always has a grain, and we are shaped by those values. Okay, so printing revolution, let's look at the way it shaped back us. We moved in the printing revolution from a culture of oral, thought that was really narrative-based to a culture of linear, complex thought. Because that's what you can do with a book that's very difficult to do just with one scroll or very difficult to do in conversation, right? You can't have a long, complex, multi tens of pages argument. And what happens in this season is that types of thought that become dependent on linear, complex thought start exploding, right? Theology actually starts turning to more linear, complex, longer, systematized arguments. The entire discipline of systematic theology, if you're familiar with that, comes out of this period. Because now you have the capacity, because of books, for organized, complex thought, and even the way we start to perceive of God shifts, right? Scientific revolution, right? That emerges out of the ability to have books which can contain complex, linear, systematized thought. It works back on us and changes the way we see the world. Mechanical revolution, right? Well, now we can make, we can do, we can produce more than we could ever produce before. So we're raised above this subsistence level, but now these factories start to create way more than we actually need. Right? Now we can make more than we need to survive. This is a brand new thing in human history. And it causes, about the year 1900, it causes the modern discipline of marketing to be birthed. Right? Marketing as we know it doesn't come around until then because we never had extra stuff that we had to convince you that you needed to buy. But now we have factories that can make it. So now we need to convince you that this is worth buying. Right? This kickback that comes from this mechanical technological revolution. Digital revolution, the one that we're in now, like new ways of communicating, yes, but what we're finding is that it's kicking back and shaping us. Just a couple examples. Attention spans for text are getting shorter, right? Our ability to read a complex, linear, systematized argument, if anybody has is in the education system or anything like that, like this has changed over the generations, like significantly. People's perceived ability to memorize has changed because we don't need to exercise that muscle anymore. It's right now in front of us, right? And you guys were mentioning it too, like there's this sense of, relationship is now this instead of what it used to be in terms of face-to-face. It's now a string of texts instead of a relationship. It's coming back and it's shaping us. It's working on us. So even if we are to say that technology is morally neutral in the sense of, like a shovel can't have moral agency, right? So it's not like a shovel is not sinful or unsinful. What we can't say is that technology is neutral in any sense. It's all in how we use it. Because technology carries values within it. Every technology, just like the world God made, has a grain. Every technology comes with a grain. It comes with a set of values that are embedded in the technology itself, that as we use it to do what we hope is good in the world, will work back on us. So the question is, what are those values? Do we know them and do we understand them for the technology that we're using in this moment, whether it's a book or whether it's a smartphone? And then how do we cooperate with or subvert those values for the purposes of human flourishing? How do we recognize the values that this technology is bringing and then either, work along with them or push back against them and subvert them even while we're using it so that we become most fully who we are meant to be? And the $1 million question is, what does it mean for humans to flourish, right? And that's where this gospel story, we're going to get into this more next week, but gives us a bit of a hint. But I think we can already see, and I just want to give a real quick case study here, of an example in the scriptures where this kind of discernment of the use of technology is already happening. It comes from 2 John 12, which you probably were just reading yesterday because you had nothing better to do, right? We're not in 2 John a whole lot. And it's one of these verses that, there's no such thing as a throwaway verse, but it's one of those verses that Okay, great. That's not one I'm gonna like. This is probably not very many people's life verse. You know what I'm saying? I think it's a fascinating piece of technological discernment. John is writing to the church and he says, I have much to write to you, but I do not want to use paper and ink. Instead, I hope to visit you and talk with you face to face so that our joy may be complete. Okay, so what technology is John using as he's writing this? Paper and ink, right? He's using paper and ink. And in this day, that was actually, we just kind of take it for granted, that was a very controversial piece of relatively new technology. The ability to send notes, to send letters this way in a way that was portable, that many different people could use. It was still pretty expensive, but it was pretty new. Socrates, just a few centuries before, had said he hated writing with paper and ink. He thought it was an awful technology. He insisted on dialogue because the only way you could actually learn anything was not just reading it off a page. You actually had to be face to face and like talk it out. That's why we don't have any of Socrates' teachings directly written down. They're all taught through his followers who were telling about the things he taught, because he didn't write anything down, because he thought it was an absolutely terrible use of technology that was going to make everybody idiotic and stupid and keep them from the truth, right? Now, John disagrees, right? Why is he using it? What natural ability is John extending through paper and ink? Absolutely, communication over distance. So he's extending the ability to communicate, right? Because we can communicate talking here, but we've got all this stuff rigged up so that people can watch this during the week, so we can communicate over space. We're using the technology in that way, right? That's what he's doing. He's extending, in one sense, his presence over space through writing in paper and ink. What? In a very limited way, right? Yes. Oh, that's a great point. That's right. Yes, absolutely. No, absolutely extended over time. This is one of the great powers of writing. That's right. We don't know what those are, as we don't know what the other things are he wanted to mention. So there's something gained and something lost in this. Now, what makes him nervous about this technology? How is he subverting the technology of paper and ink? Yeah, he says there's more I want to say, but interestingly, like, he could say everything he wants to say in paper and ink in terms of information. Right. He can't have dialogue, he doesn't have feedback, he doesn't have the personal presence, right? So he subverts the technology by saying, I'm only going to use it for this little note. If you know 2 John, right, it's tiny, right? This is the last verse, or the next to last verse. I'm only going to use it for this little note, and then I'm going to stop. He makes a different decision than Paul makes in the Epistle to the Romans, right? Paul's like, no, let's do this thing. We're writing this whole thing out. And I also want to see you face to face. John makes a little bit different decision here. Because what is he trying to protect? Right. He's trying to protect this vision of human flourishing, which is, if you want to say it this way, incarnational, that is only fully achieved face to face, and out of which joy springs up, right? He's trying to protect the difference between sending an email to your friend and having coffee with your friend. He's trying to protect the difference between Zooming someone and actually being in the room together. Because for him, there is something about human flourishing that is irreducibly incarnational, embodied, face-to-face relationship. But even in the midst of that vision, he's still willing to use it for this limited certain purpose. That right there, in a nutshell, is the type of discernment that I think we're invited into. And we need some tools for that. But that's the kind of discernment that I think we're invited into as believers to say, what is human flourishing? What's the fullness that we're going for? Realize that, we may not be able to have that in every single situation, or there may be places where we can press into that in a limited way, which are not sufficient in and of themselves, but still valuable. But out of that vision of human flourishing, we can start to discern, what is this good for and what is this not good for? Paper and ink are great for the letter to the Romans. They're not necessarily as great for our joy being complete in face-to-face interaction. Okay, let's stop here for a second. Questions, thoughts, reflections. What's jumping out at you from this? Take this, pass this back. There you go.
There's a humility in John saying, I want to talk to you face to face, because it implies feedback. It implies I'm not going to be preaching to you. I'm going to be listening to you as well. And maybe he modifies his thinking. But anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. Any relationship that's actually a relationship requires some humility. Yeah.
I think it's interesting that he says our joy. It's kind of what you're talking about, but I know a friend of mine, we would read books on tape to each other. And so it felt like we were together. But whoever was listening was the only one who was actually enjoying it, right? The other person didn't get the whole completeness.
Yeah.
I think it's, he's identified the limitations of communication. Communication is always an attempt to be understood and to understand. And you use different tools for that. So writing and face-to-face, and they all have their aspects of good or limitations. And
they all have their values.
Right. So I think he's saying, hey, look, this is too limited. I want our joy to. So when he goes into joy, he's very clear that that's all about that closeness and that face-to-face relationship.
Yep, absolutely. And he knows that text can't get him all the way there. No.
I find it interesting that, sorry to expand past the John conversation, I find it interesting that when we take technology and we obviously expand it beyond our modern views of digital technology, things like that, that the entirety of what our religion is based on and the entirety of what a lot of argument gets generated by is a piece of technology. The Bible, as we know it, as we understand it, as we interact with it and experience it, is entirely a piece of technology or based upon a piece of technology that, by your definition, necessarily transforms God's creation and probably is flawed. To say something that's
As she pulls the microphone away from her mouth.
I'm going to stop talking now.
Yeah.
Someone else can.
Well, no, and we're going to get into this in a second. What we're going to do next is have what's our frame for discernment? Our frame for discernment is the gospel. And the biblical story, actually there is a biblical story of technology, and this is part of it, right? 2 John, written in a technological form that John is like, this is a little bit less than, comes all the way down to us as sacred scripture, right? There's such an irony and intriguing reality to that why would God use this form of technology, or how could God use this form of technology for our benefit, right? And we'll talk about that in a second, because there are limitations.
As it is necessarily technology. technology. I guess my point is, as it is necessarily technology, how is it like? Do we see our own biases and our own misuses of it because it is
Oh.
technology,
Yeah.
right? Like, I think that we tend to say, this is the Bible, this is God's word. Therefore, we all know that the Bible can be misused, yes, but I think that we tend to have a lot of blind spots for the ways that it is misused because we tend to see it as holy as opposed to a holy piece of technology, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. Or as a means to a more significant end, and not an end in and of itself, right? Jesus even points that out with the scriptures. You know, you read the scriptures thinking that in them you have eternal life, but it's they that testify of me. Like, so there's a sense in which this technology is a tool pointing to something, and we got to use it in the way in which it's intended, or we could use it in the wrong way and it kicks back and shapes us in inappropriate ways because it is just a tool. It's good.
It makes me think, and maybe this is a deeper topic for another conversation of even, let me collect my thought here. Communication is always a top priority. And how are we going to communicate with one another? And in God communicating to us, he had other ways of communicating in the Old Testament, but in an incarnational way, he said, really the only way you're going to get to know me is for me to come to you face to face so that our joy can be complete. Obviously, a lot more other reasons than that, but it does give this sense of embodied communication trumps everything else. And even around the house with my kids, like I've noticed that there's a dramatic difference from when we are communicating and they're looking at me and I'm looking at them versus when we're, shouting across from a room to room, or, someone saying something like it. The communication isn't as effective until it is like this. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And yet, there's good work that we've been given to do in the world that can't be done like this, right? So let's get into this a little bit, how we do this work of discernment. If the fullness is that kind of relational union, right? How do we discern how technology is or isn't useful in that, okay? Our primary tool for discernment is the gospel. And this is what I mean when I title this class The Gospel According to Technology. When I announced it the other day, there were snickers across the room. Because what are you, like, the technology is not going to save us. I'm like, yes, that is absolutely true. But there is good news in which technology needs to be and can be and will be saved. The gospel is good news for humanity. It's good news for all creation. But I would also argue it's good news for what humanity does with creation. There is a gospel narrative for the things that we make because they are an extension and a part of us. They're actually part of what God's given us to do. So if they cannot be rescued, then I would say us in our fullness cannot be rescued because this is part of who God has made us to be. Okay? We'll get there in a second. But if you've been to any of these contexts at all, you know one of the ways I find really helpful to sum up the gospel and to lay out how do we talk about what the gospel is in any particular area, whether it's politics or gender or whatever, is to trace the gospel story like it's a 5-act play. Act 1 of the story is creation. Right? God has made all things, made us good with good purposes. Act 2 is the fall, everything falls apart. Act 3, redemption, is through Israel, and then culminating in Jesus, everything begins to be put back together. Act 5 is everything is going to be put back together perfectly, and finally one day all shall be well and all manner of things shall be well. And then in Act 4, between the redemption we see at least in Scripture and consummation that we see in Scripture is us. And we don't take this the wrong way, but we don't have a script for Act 4, right? There isn't an epistle that drops out of the heavens when you wake up every morning. Like, this is exactly what you should do today to be faithful to the gospel. We have to improvise this. But what we're doing, hopefully, is knowing the story so well in Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, Act 5, that we can live our lives in such a way that we can faithfully improvise what's happening so that it fits the entire story, right? So think about example like one of the old hymns, right? Always 4 verses, at least. 4th verse is always about Jesus coming again, right? 1st and 2nd are always about something Jesus has done. Imagine there's no verse 3. We've got to write verse 3. We would want to write verse 3 in a way that it comes out of verses 1 and 2, and it leads to verse 4 in such a way that the entire story makes sense, right? Or another way to think about it, think about a piece of classical music or a Shakespeare play, right? Mozart's Requiem never got finished, right? One of the most amazing pieces of classical music there ever was. And what happened was he died before it got done, and somebody else, whose name I can't remember at this very moment, came along and was like, I got to finish this. And so what he did is he studied it so intently that he was able to write the rest of it such that it made one piece, it made one kind of work with the rest of the Requiem, such that if you listen to it now with an untrained ear, you're like, I don't know where like Mozart stops and this other guy begins. That's the hope. That's what a faithful improvisation looks like, okay? So what we need to do is to go through Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, Act 5 for technology, so that we can get a sense of, okay, now how do I live my life such that I can improvise in a way that fits the story. Okay, so Act 1, creation. We are technological beings. I would argue that we're actually made to mess with God's creation. Image of God. Genesis 1, 26 through 28, right? You read 1, 26 through 28, it's that foundational passage of we're made in God's image, and there's a couple different things there. There's relationships that are being formed in that space as part of the way we reflect and image God, male and female, he created them. There's life, a life-creating aspect to who we are, that male and female, when they unite, something happens, and life is made. That ability to create life is part of what it means to be made in the image of God and reflect him. But then it also says, right? What does it say? What's the first command? Fill the earth, and then subdue it, right? That language of subduing isn't like an oppressive language necessarily. It's just an authority language. It's an overseeing language. It's a gardening language. It's a language that says, okay, here's all the things I made. Now do something with it. Take what I've made, and I don't mean this in like a crass way, but like make it better. We often think of the garden as this perfectly manicured paradise. It's more like a wilderness of raw material just waiting to be farmed so that it would be fruitful, right? And so what he gives us in one sense is the raw materials, and he says, okay, I want to invite you into this work of creation alongside me. Go make a thing, and let's make it good. Now there were some boundaries on that making. Genesis 2:15, I think lays this out most clearly. God tells Adam to do two things. He tells him to work the garden and to keep the garden. Another translation would be till the garden and guard the garden. Okay? Now there's some significance to these two things. These are the two verbs that are used all throughout the Old Testament to talk about worship in the sanctuary, pointing to the fact that every bit of work that we do is actually an expression of worship, an act of worship, which is fascinating in and of itself. But God is telling Adam to do two kind of different things, very different things actually. One, work it, till it, change it, make something new of it, transform of it, do something technological with it, but then also keep it, guard it. There's a sense in which, hey, do something with this, but not to the extent that it changes the fundamental nature of the thing, right? There's a bounds to your creative work. Don't create in such a way that it's working against the grain of my creation. Work in such a way that it's working with the grain of my creation. Make something of it, but also protect its basic integrity. And I think if there's a dystopia when it comes to technology, we've done everything on the working and tilling and nothing of the keeping and guarding, or at least being aware of that. Okay? But we need both. We need both. You see this immediately in the naming of the animals, right? When Adam names the animals. Language is actually, I would argue, a type of technology, right? And so he's given the task of, okay, here's an animal, name this thing. And Adam's job wasn't to come up with the most creative, absurd thing he could think of to name this animal. The work of naming was a work of recognizing what is the essence of this thing? Like what is the beauty and the goodness of this thing that God has put in front of me? I think this word describes that. So it's a creative, technological act, but one that is in line with the thing that is sitting in front of him, not trying to subvert or not trying to dominate or oppress or make it into something different. It's trying to recognize the capacity of what is already there. Okay? That's a picture of like, let's work it, let's till it, let's give it a name, but let's keep it and guard it. Let's give it a name in line with what it is. Okay? Do something with it, but don't change the integrity. That, of course, is a great idea, and it falls apart. And again throughout the story, technology becomes one of the ways in which we turn away from God and others. It's one of the means, one of the tools we use to turn away from that. Okay? Say, first example, fig leaves. Fig leaves were just fig leaves, right? They were an expression of the abundance of creation. Something that we were supposed to be able to see God through until we take them and begin to use them to hide from one another and from God. Right? It's a use of a technology to create distance. Genesis 4 is actually the clearest expression of this, but usually when we talk about Genesis, like we kind of bracket it like Genesis 1, Genesis 2, Genesis 3, and now we're going to skip to wherever we're skipping to, at least to Noah and like Genesis 6. Genesis 4 is fascinating. It's all about Cain's line. It's Cain killing Abel, right? Which he uses a tool, we think, to do that. But everything has been agricultural up till now. And Cain is on the run from God, and what he does is he's the first one after he's cast out to go build a city. He's the first one who goes and builds a city. And it seems like he builds this city to find safety, to not be quite so vulnerable. In the Old Testament, cities are almost always negative. Very rare occasions, other than the city of God, like Zion, Jerusalem, right? That would be one of the only times a city is portrayed positively. Otherwise, they're negative because they're a technology, they're a structure that in the beginning is being used to find safety, to find refuge, to run away from, to try to protect yourself from those who might do you harm. Later in Cain's line comes the first technological revolution. Right? It talks about iron tools being used and musical instruments being made. And they're all in Cain's line. All the technology comes out of Cain's line. And you're thinking, oh, maybe they've redeemed themselves. And then in verses 23 and 24 of Genesis 4, we see Lamech. Lamech is the kind of a guy you don't want to meet in a dark alley. He says, I'll kill a man for wounding me. You just see this violence like spiraling downward. And so the picture you get in Cain's line of just this sort of drain developing, of we're just spiraling more and more around death. And the picture you get of these technological revolutions is they are part of the story of running away from God instead of co-creating with him with the grain of creation. We're using the technology to replace the relationship we once had with God, in a sense. Tower of Babel would be like kind of the ultimate example of this in the first part of Genesis, right? The Tower of Babel is not done as a way of expressing praise to God. It's a way of saying, we're terrified. We know that we are fragile and vulnerable, but if we come together and we build this thing, we're going to make a name for ourselves and we're going to be something. It's a use of technology in exactly the opposite direction of the kind of building God was inviting us into. It's done not to be dependent on him, but independent of him. Technology extends every aspect of us, right? We talked about it. It extends our natural capacities. Well, that means it's going to extend the dignified parts and it's going to extend the fallen parts, right? It's going to take our natural propensity to run away from God and not be dependent on him and just magnify that when the fall comes around. But there is redemption, right? There are redemptive purposes for this technology. One of the most obvious is that technology is used over and over again to limit the suffering of the fall. Right? The fall brings tremendous suffering, but God gives us technology, right? Think of, in terms of modern terms, think of medical technology, to limit the effects of the fall, to limit the effects of the curse. I remember for our first kid going into the hospital, Sarah going into labor, and we were she wanted at first to try to do it without an epidural. I was like, oh, that's so cool. Like, it's so neat. It's so brave. It's awesome. And we got 60 hours into labor. Not even kidding. And she's like, I think I'm ready for that epidural. Why press into the fall more than we have to? that was her theological informed phrase. Like, in that, why press into the fall more than we have to? And I've thought about that a lot since. Like, God does show us a common grace, give us a reprieve by limiting the effects of suffering of the fall through technologies. But technology also moves the story forward, right? Genesis 3, right? Adam and Eve sin, they're now cut off from God, and God says, okay, I'm going to clothe you. I can do better than these fig leaves. And God actually makes the technology of animal skins, of clothing. Now, in the creation of that, he's actually teaching them something about his character, teaching them something about the covering they're going to need, the need for a sacrifice to atone, right? There's all kinds of things being taught in that animal skin, but that's the technology he creates. Noah and the ark, right? Genesis 6, God says, here's some new tech for you. And this is going to get you through this next season, right? I've thought a significant amount about what would have happened in a COVID season with our society structured the way it is, without the arc, right, of a Zoom, or without the arc of some of this technology that we had to help get us through this season, at least in certain ways when it was starting. Like, that's an incredible gift. Right? One of the more interesting examples would be writing and the 10 Commandments. Israel is in Egypt as this transformation from hieroglyphs to the phonetic alphabet is happening, right? They're in the midst of that technological revolution, the shift in the alphabet, while they are in Egypt, according to the best historical sources. They were sort of in the Silicon Valley of their day in a lot of ways. Now, they're oppressed and enslaved in the Silicon Valley, but they're still kind of imbibing this technology, right? Before that, you can't really, hieroglyphs don't translate very easily, right? So it's mainly an oral culture. Well, this phonetic alphabet allows more things to be written down. And think about the value of things being written down. One of the values of writing as a form of technology is it's permanent and it's accessible, right? It's always there for you to be able to access. Well, when Israel leaves Egypt, goes out into the wilderness, God somehow uses not hieroglyphs, but presumably this phonetic alphabet, this new form of technology, to communicate his character and his purposes for them in a way that is not just oral, but is now permanent, such that they can put it in the Ark of the Covenant, and accessible. In other words, he uses this new technology to teach them things with the grain of that technology that they would not have had access to before. Really interesting in the historical context of it. Then you can get in, and we won't go into all the details, but the craft and the creation of the tabernacle, right? All the different images, all the different pictures, all the different metal work that's required there. That is all technological work. In fact, the first people in the scriptures to be filled with the Spirit are Bezalel and Aholiab, filled with the Spirit to actually build a thing. Like the first time we're ever referred to as being filled with the Spirit as humanity is making a technology. And it's creating this place of worship, this place that represents heaven coming down to earth. Interestingly, there was a limit on that visual technology because there are no images of God. Right? Can't make a picture of God. So there's a limit to this visual technology. But like visual technology in itself, good thing. Let's use it. Right? And in the New Testament, right? How does technology move the story forward? You've got the cross. That's a piece of technology. That's a Roman execution technology. And it worked great. You've got roads and seafaring and letters without which the book of Acts wouldn't make any sense. You've got the shift from the codex to the scroll. From the scroll to the codex. The scroll was what things were written on before, and that's probably what John is writing on. But what develops in the 100s, 200s, going into the 300s is this codex, this book form. It's the nascent form of the book as we think about it. And that changes the imagination from pieces of like, okay, here's the scroll to Corinth, and here's the scroll of 2 John, and here's the scroll to 1 John. And it allows all those to be contained in one binding, if you will, so that it creates this sense of unity and one story as opposed to a whole bunch of different stories that you're having to unpack as you go over time. That technology of the codex creates, or at least reflects, the imagination. I wouldn't say creates. It reflects the imagination for, hey, this is all one big story that God's been doing. Let's put it between a couple bindings and read it like it's one book and not a whole bunch of separate books. That technological revolution is happening as the canon of the New Testament is being formalized. Okay, so let's go to Act 5. Act 5, consummation. What you find in Act 5, kind of unrelentingly, when all things are made new, is that the cities, which were almost wholly negative, actually become redeemed and become positive images of the world as it will be. Isaiah 2, 1 through 3 talks about the nation streaming in to Zion to learn what it means to follow God. Revelation 21 has this picture, right, of the heavenly city coming down out of heaven. Right? It's a city specifically. It's not another garden. It's a city. It is a reflection of things being made by our hands. Our shared work of being co-creators with God. That is part of the world to come as it is made new. Our tools become redeemed, right? You see the language of our swords are going to be turned into plowshares, right? Those swords are tools for war. They're going to be tools for agriculture, but interestingly, they stay tools, which gives a hint that maybe we're still going to be using technology in the age to come. Maybe we're still going to be making things, but that now go back to the intent of fruitfulness and not violence anymore. Revelation 21, 24 through 26, really fascinating passage there where it talks about how the kings of the nations will bring their glory into that heavenly city. The best of the things that the nations have made, the best of the things that we've put together, now get included in that final city and wrapped into God's ultimate purpose. So we're not going towards a future where technology will save us, but we're also not going towards a future where technology will destroy us. And these are our two basic attitudes, right? Or where it will cease to exist, yes. Or that will be our downfall, right? Technology is caught up in the redemptive work of what God is about. So if technology still exists and can be redeemed in Act 5, we don't need to be Amish. the technologies that we have been given can be caught up in that redemptive work. Right? We just have to be wise and discerning about how that technology works within the grain of the story and can be redeemed in the grain of the story, and not get stuck back in Act 2, right? Where it's mainly just an extension of all our worst impulses. Questions, thoughts, observations from the biblical part of the story here. Acts 1, 2, 3, and 5. Hold on just a second, brother.
I mean, thank you for pointing that out, that it really developed out of Cain's line. And I guess when you really think about it, everything sort of developed out of Cain's line.
Well, there are other children of Adam and Eve, all
Right.
the genealogies play all that out.
Okay.
But there is a sense regardless of what exactly we think is happening in Genesis 1 through 11, right? And what aspects is this poetry, and what aspects is this true myth, and what aspects is this history, et cetera, et cetera. But one of the things that comes out of that very clearly in the text is trying to paint as all these technological advancements, they're going to end up being used for awesome stuff. But at the beginning, they're coming out of this desire which may not necessarily be holy. In other words, there is at the very least an edge to these things which may be less of a co-creating with God like he intended for us to do, and more of a creating in such a way that, maybe I won't need God, or I can be safe from God, or I can be safe from other people if I do these things.
Sort of a fear-based,
Absolutely.
yeah. So-
Absolutely. Which has not changed all that much. I think TikTok on Cain, I think absolutely. A fear of being left out. Yes, totally. Or China, one of the two. Okay.
Mentioned in 2 John, I think is really important, that the technology is there and can be used redemptively, but it's not a substitute for other things,
Yes.
which is the face-to-face.
Yes.
And there are so many things right now that our technology, and it's so fast, that it can displace all sorts of other things that are more important, at least as important, more important. And it gets in the way of relationships, it gets in the way of enjoying God's nature, it gets in the way of all sorts of things.
Absolutely.
And that's the temptation.
Yes.
And there's always been a temptation with technology.
Yep. Absolutely. It's in one sense, I don't mean this to trivialize it, but it's simply an extension of the story we already know, right? The story we already know, right? Every time, this is one of the reasons I love talking about things that are hard to talk about or we're all interested in. Because the deeper you get into them, the more you realize, this is the same story and all the things I know, right? Now there's new applications, we need new language, we need new ways of seeing it, but fundamentally, we have a hard time trusting God. And we're going to use our technology as an extension of that difficulty in trusting God. We also all have this beautiful created dignity which reflects God even as we're in the midst of distrusting him and destroying all these things, which is part of the goodness and the glory that comes with any of these technologies. It's amazing what we can do. It's all wrapped up in there together. It reflects God and it's simultaneously a running away from God. Just like everything else we do. And the key is learning to discern, what part of this is me running away from God? And how is this technology kind of tempting me towards that? And how is this technology reflecting the goodness of who he's made me to be? And being redeemed such that I can actually live more fully into the life that God's given me to live. It's the same story. just writ in the language of technology. Nope, it hasn't. Yep. Yes. Absolutely. Yep. Okay. So here is what I want to do next. You all should have gotten the notes, the slides, if you signed up for the class in your email. At least one person in the group should have them. Here's what I want us to do. I want us to do a little bit of a case study on some types of technology. They're not just personal digital technology, just to give us a chance to run through some of this gospel thought process, okay? John Dyer, in his book, Garden of the City, has some reflection questions that reflect each aspect of this story. Questions from creation, questions about the fall and how it's impacted this technology, questions about redemption and restoration, okay? So here's what I want to do. I want to break up into those groups again and give you guys just a few minutes to think and process through some of these questions. Somebody should have them open. You can pick one or two that fit with each one of these. But here's what I want you to look at. One of the things every church has to decide for songs is whether it's going to use a hymnal or whether it's going to use a screen. Both are forms of technology. Both have values and grains within them. Both of them are great at some things and poor at others. I want this group, just because I want to mess with Rick a little bit, to take screens. I knew you'd love that. And I want this group to take like hymnals or books, okay? Think about what it means to sing out of each one of those forms of technology and look at these questions. They're here on the slides, but there's a whole set of questions for creation, fall, redemption, restoration, redemption, restoration. You're not going to look at all of them by any sense. We're only going to do this for about 5-10 minutes, okay? So just pick out a couple, somebody who's got access to it. Screens, books. Let's think about how screens and books fit into the story of what God is doing in the gospel and how they might apply to singing. Okay? Make sense? Does somebody have the questions over here? Oh, come on, Judy. Does anybody else have them for this group? We need another copy for this group. He does have it on digital technology. Okay, here's what I'll do for you guys. Start with a question here. Pick out a question as it relates to books, okay? And then when you're ready, I'll take you to the next set of slides for another question. That's true, we should have little BCP. All right, let's come back in. All right, what were some of your gospel-shaped reflections on screens versus books? And thanks for letting me mess with you. We were talking in our group about how there are embedded values with each one, and they kind of, neither of them are perfect in terms of what we're aiming for here. So what were some of your reflections on screens and books?
Oh, my first reflection was, when you use a screen, you got to sing the melody. Nobody sings harmony.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
There's none of that. You can sing different
Unless
verses.
you already know it and can just figure it out.
Unless you've got an ear, unless you can figure it out.
Yep.
Right. But that's one of my biggest things with it. But I like having a bunch of different verses where the theology or whatever's in there
Sure.
builds. So,
Yep.
And we can do that on the screen too.
Mm-hmm. What are some of the values behind the screen?
Well, we were saying that the pros and cons. Screen is going to be, it's in the moment.
Mm-hmm.
Like you have to sing what's up there. A con would be like if it's printed, you can actually read ahead or read behind, and you can reflect on the entire message or theology of the song versus okay, this is the 4 lines we're singing right now.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a sense of dependence and independence we talked about.
Oh, interesting.
If there's,
Yeah.
if there's a book, then I am independent and I can sing what I want to. If it's a screen, we're dependent on the person in the back.
We're dependent on the tech people. Yes.
They have to have typed up the words correctly, and they have to be on top of,
Yes.
press and go.
Yep.
We talked pros from a musician standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
You can hear everyone because if you're a screen, the voices are now accessible because instead of looking down,
Yep.
everyone is projecting out,
Absolutely.
and so you can more participate in the worship of the people.
Mm-hmm.
What else did we talk about?
No, I think what you're to sum up a little bit of this, like screens, the way I would frame about it, have a more communal, in many ways, value that goes with them because everybody has to look at the same place, right? You're all looking together at the same time in the same way, whereas books have a little bit more of an individual feel. But books definitely have greater permanence. That's one of the things we talked about in this group. So that it's not something flits across the screen and goes away. There's something that you can come back to and focus on and dwell in deeper ways time after time after time after time. Both of those, I think in many ways, are like gospel goods. You know what I mean? They're ways, things that reflect the truth and the fullness, but they do it in different ways. Judy?
We talked about permanence and impermanence.
Oh, yeah.
essentially.
There you go. Sorry. Yeah.
Screens let you add more songs more easily.
Oh, sure. There's a wider
Which
range of things
I mean,
you can
when
access.
you have, and you mentioned this, when you have a hymn book, it's static. I
Mhm.
mean, there might be 600 hymns in there, and you've only sung about 30 of them,
Right.
but it's more static.
Yes.
So you can add new things.
Yeah, totally. What about this? Let's go over here. Other things about books that we talked about versus screens.
Well, the books have the music as well as the words, which is wonderful. I guess we could do that on a screen, but no one ever does it. So
It's a ton of work.
So we're just talking about, kind of the way things are. But yes, permanence, and which is good and bad. Bad theology in songs, good theology in songs, they're permanent in a book. But the going back to is so nice because, I like bringing my Bible. I'm having mine rebound right now because it tore apart. But I get to look at the scriptures when it's printed, or the verses when they're sung, and read it. And then when the song's over and there's a moment of reflection, you're reading that again. It's just, wow, this is really sinking in. So the screen's come and gone, and I'm still relishing in how the Spirit is moving me through those words. So there's that.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
We also talked about.
There's no good reason to not have the score on the slides. Like music on slides.
Andrew, coming in. Hey, I've been trying to hire you forever, man, and you haven't let me. You just opened the door.
We talked about the ability to take it home and share it with other people. So it's possible to take it home and to share it with other people and take it beyond just the place where it was when you have a book.
Yeah, absolutely. I like that you brought up Bibles because this is another question, like, should I bring the physical Bible or read the Bible on my phone? And what they've found is that we tend to read longer passages when we have a physical Bible, like we stick with it longer, but we read more just in terms of quantity of reading on our phones because of the accessibility of it. So you read more, you come back to it more often than I gotta go get my Bible and open it up. But when you read the Bible in print, you actually end up reading it more deeply and longer, which is fascinating. Yep. Megan, last comment.
Real quick, different direction to take this is that technology changes the focus of things. So to throw a tiny bit of shade on the screen, I think that one of the modern I'll just get to the point. screens have opened the door for things like a very modern form of worship, where it's very easy for the worship band to become like a rock concert and the worship leader to become the star of that. And that's why we
Yes.
have celebrity worship pastors, which I just think is a really bizarre concept. But like, go back to pianos and organs, like there was no celebrity like worship.
That's not
There was
always
a tiny
true,
bit,
but it was
like,
trickier.
It was trickier, and
yes.
the focus tended to be less, like almost always the piano and the organ sit off to the side. And when you sing, it's more of this communal experience. Like if you've ever stood in a group of people singing a song, whether a cappella or with musicians, it's a totally different experience than all of your focus being on these people in the front and the singular person who is kind of like leading you and telling you how to feel and move and be in that moment. And that doesn't have to be the way that it is, but I think that it is a necessary evil it's a temptation. It's something that's come out of that has, again, exploited the worst of humanity. And I think that it completely shifts the focus of what worship otherwise is this thing where we're singing to one another. Now we're very much singing in a different way.
It's probably come back and bit us in that way. It shaped us back in certain ways. Absolutely. And one of the things I would argue is that hymnals can have a tendency to shape us back as being non-expressive in worship. And I think the move to the screen was in part an attempt to free up people's hands, right? To have some different kind of postures of praise, which are just not possible with a book. Like you've probably seen me, I've got my clergy bulletin on the front row, and sometimes I'll be like this, and I'm like holding up my clergy bulletin, like trying not to drop it because it tells me what I'm supposed to say next, right? And it's an awkward moment. So there are values inherent in both of these things that I hope what I'm trying to get us to see is that go beyond right and wrong, right? There are certain values that really lead to a vision of flourishing and really work against a vision of flourishing in different ways. And what's often lost in these debates about technology is the ability to say, okay, here's the values of the screen that lead us to a greater fullness. Here's the values of a book that lead to a greater fullness of what worship is meant to be. How can we have the best of both worlds? And barring that, what are the particular formational needs of this day, this time, this moment? And we're still going to disagree on that. But it becomes a disagreement about wisdom, a disagreement about discernment, a disagreement about what is God doing in this place at this time, and not a disagreement about good versus evil. Because both of them have got good and bad wound up in them. Okay? So the reason why I brought that out is now I want to take all that and now bring it into the personal digital technology conversation, right? All that in one sense is prelude for what we're actually here to do, okay? And we're going to talk about it a few minutes tonight, and then we're going to get into it more deeply next time. But we need that kind of discernment, and we need to be fostering that kind of discernment in ourselves so that we're not looking at this as right or wrong, too much time, too little time. No, let's go more deeply into this. Okay. What are the values of personal digital technology? How does this fit into the story? I want to differentiate between personal technology, right, and industrial medical technology, which is a whole nother realm of technology, which we could do a whole nother class on, which would be super fun, and we're not going to do that. And then AI, honestly, is a whole nother realm of technology that is it's been around, but it's bursting on the scene in a new way with ChatGPT, and how does this affect like college exam papers? And it's going to be fascinating, and we're not going to talk about any of that. Although it's quite interesting, and if you're curious to think more about that, Russell Moore just wrote an article for Christianity Today about how ChatGPT can't replace preaching. It's a great theological reflection on how you can't get a chatbot to write your sermon for you where it's not really a sermon. It's great. It's great. It's a really, really great article, okay? Now, digital personal technology really sums up kind of three big areas in terms of our personal lives, these three big things. The internet, which is really like books and photographs and the telegraph and the telephone, sort of all jammed into one thing, okay? That's functionally what the internet is. It's combining lots of different technologies that we've had and making them all available to us all the time. Smartphones give us continual internet access in our pockets, right? We always have access to anything. Books, photographs, telegraphs, telephones, videos can tell us at any time. And then if you want to take it to another level, social media curates the internet to our own personal taste, our own personal preferences. It's our own personal internet crafted just for us, in a sense. Okay, it's kind of an internet within the internet. Now, what tends to happen is that digital immigrants tend to use these things, but only sparingly, and digital natives are just on them all the time. That's kind of been the typical story for new technologies over time. What is happening with this generation, though, and I'm seeing it in my own family, is that these technologies are so powerful that at this point it is sometimes the natives who are recognizing something is wrong and pulling back, and the immigrants who are saying, I'm all in on this, right? The transformation, for example, of Facebook from a tool for college students to now the social media platform that is used by the oldest demographic is fascinating. That transition from immigrants to natives and then back again. So we need to understand the values of this personal digital technology. What is the grain of personal digital technology, and how is that positive for a sense of human flourishing, and how is it negative towards a sense of human flourishing? Okay, access would be the first value. We can now access everything. This has become our expectation. You can tell by the fact that if something's behind a paywall, you're ticked. Right? How dare this thing be behind a paywall? I expect access, because that is a value that the internet has formed in us and that it brings with us. We now have access to everything. It used to be that knowledge was limited to our relational networks. Now it's just limited to how we can focus the search engine of Google or Bing or whatever it is. Now there's good in this, right? Because there's good, helpful information that resides outside our natural networks. People we love who are not immediately available. Things that are just more unusual in life. I think about my grandmother was one of the first people diagnosed in the U.S. with celiac sprue disease, if you're familiar with this. And this was back in the 80s. And there was nothing out there because there wasn't the communication, right, between doctors that there is now. There wasn't the same kind of information floating, certainly around the lay public. There was no WebMD that you could just go and talk to. So she was having to come up with all this herself, all the recipes for gluten-free stuff. She started to design herself. People would correspond with her. They'd write her a letter saying, I've just been diagnosed with celiac sprue. What do I do? She was one of the approved people. She would send, here's 5 recipes to start out with, and here's where you can get your potato flour and all this. I mean, all this was happening in slow motion over correspondence, right? And now you just type in celiac, and you've got a wealth of things that you can operate in. Helpful Bible teaching is all over the place. This is good stuff. If your preacher stinks, right, you can just go listen to another preacher, right? This is a good thing. You've got Facebook groups for all these niche interests. This is good. There's also a lot of bad things, right, about having access to everything all the time, because there's a lot of things which do not lead to flourishing, right? Porn magazines are in the tank. Don't need porn magazines anymore. It's all right there available. On the spiritual side, false teaching, it's rampant. One of the hardest things for me about going on social media is just seeing so much ridiculousness. And just people bearing false witness about each other and about God. And it's just overwhelming, right? The ugly is that we lose our ability to truly know anything when we have access to everything, or connect with anyone when we have access to everyone. Studies have shown that our prefrontal cortex, the part that makes decisions and operates with discernment, actually shuts down when we input it with too many things. Like it just goes dark. We can be paralyzed by having too many choices. And you think about the Facebook feed, or you think about the digital news all the time. Like this is what is happening, is we're losing our ability to actually make decisions and discern because the amount of inputs coming at us is just frankly unnatural, right? Because we've never had access to this much stuff before. Yeah, go for it. Yeah, we'll talk about that in a minute.
Okay.
We're going to talk about how it tends to reinforce biases. Okay, another value. Speed. You can now access everything and everyone faster than you ever could, right? Theoretically, we could get at most of the knowledge we have now if we were like wizards of the Dewey Decimal System. You know what I mean? You don't need that mess anymore. It's like right there. If Google takes more than half a second, you're like, what is wrong with my computer, right? It's all right there all the time. Now, there's good things to this. Greater efficiency allows us to like get more done, to find out what we want to find out quicker, to connect more often. Our ability to multitask has actually increased. I know some people talk about like the negatives of that, but that actually is a skill. It is an amazing thing. We can multitask and do multiple things at the same time far better than previous generations because we can do these things at such speed. It's training our minds to be able to pop, 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 pop. That is its own value, its own skill. The problem is it creates more shallow connections with the world around us, right? It changes the way that we interact with the information. It doesn't just speed up the same process, it actually changes the process of interaction, okay? So there's a study done that I find fascinating with reading text. And people were given 5 minutes of reading a certain text, same text, on the internet and in print. And you were given 5 minutes to read it, and then you take a little quiz after it. The retention was exactly the same if you had 5 minutes with internet and 5 minutes with print. What was different is if you did the test over again, or not over again, but with a different group, and you said, okay, you've got as long as you want to read this, and then take a quiz. Go for it. The people who read it on the internet were trained to read it fast, and they didn't retain as much. The people who read it in print lingered over it, processed it, and did much better on the quiz afterwards. So it's not just a matter of like the number of minutes. It's my whole approach when I read something on the internet is to read it fast because I'm used to the value of speed that it brings. And if I'm reading a book, I'm used to reading it more slowly and reflectively, right? Where there's the difference between scanning and reflective reading. Both of them are valuable in their own ways. They're training in different skills. But if we don't read anywhere but the internet, we lose that value of reflective reading. Same thing with like check-ins and searching conversation. You know what I mean? If we write an email back and forth like, hey, how you doing? Oh, I'm doing good. Okay, awesome. If we could sit down for like 2 minutes, there would be more depth to that than the 10 minutes it took for me to write this email, right? I've actually like spent more time doing less connection in that sense, okay? What ultimately happens if we only go in this direction of speed is we lose our ability to reflect and ponder, which is necessary for turning information into what David Brooks, a New York Times columnist, has called crystallized knowledge. Right? We actually have to let things crystallize. We actually have to let things come together. All we have otherwise is continuous partial attention to all kinds of different things, and it never actually integrates together. Okay, another value is ease. There's very little required of you in an online environment. It costs you basically nothing, which is why when you're exhausted and you don't want to do anything else, you'll just scroll. It takes nothing out of you. Now, the good of this is that for folks who do not have much capacity, right, or as much capacity, think about folks with disabilities, right? This is an absolute game changer. Like we've had friends with CP, cerebral palsy, here at IAC, and their ability to communicate through typing or their ability to communicate in digital ways unlocks this whole person that's on the inside. It's so easy, right? Even a toddler can do it, right? Which enables a whole host of glories to come to the surface, it's really quite beautiful. It also allows us to reclaim the overlap between our public lives and our private lives. And I know some people don't like this, but historically, one of the values of families was we worked together as we're living life together. Work and life weren't these two completely separate realms. It was actually the Industrial Revolution that changed that, when the guy has to go off to work in the factories, or the kid has to go off to work in the factories, and everybody else stays at home. It's so easy now to like just check in on Sarah or check in on my kid that it allows us actually in some ways to keep our priorities a little bit more in line in terms of our families, and allows us to not just shut them out when we're doing work, which may make our work suffer and make us frustrated, but there is something good about that. It's so easy. The bad is it creates consumers instead of creators, right? It's way easier to listen to music than it is to make it. To look up a Google image search versus painting a picture, right? It turns us into consumers instead of creators, which is ultimately what we were made to be, is co-creators with God. It takes relationships and it turns them into more of an ambient intimacy, is a phrase that I've heard that I really like. The illusion that we actually know somebody just because we're around them and sort of interacting with them. And we become, Sherry Turkle talks about being alone together, right? We're always together, but we never actually feel together. So there's always this distance, right? We do breakups by texting instead of doing it face to face. It's just easier. Just easier. Talk to some of your teenagers about that. It happens all the time. And the ugly is that we actually lose the ability to sustain effort towards anything difficult. And when something hard happens, we just run to what's easiest. And that escape becomes habitual. There's a study that says we now check our phone every 4.3 minutes of our waking lives on average. Hard thought comes up, hard thing comes up, hard emotion comes up, boom, I'm going to what's easy. Last value, personalization. Everything is tailored to you and your needs, and this is the echo chamber that you were talking about, Rick. The good is that we have access to more of what we care about and less of what we don't, right? The bad is that you become a bubble to yourself and others. You can craft the self you present to others and create a bubble of what you experience from the world, because everything we're putting out is mediated by some technology. It's not that face-to-face where you can't cover up. It's amazing how quickly in a conversation with someone I can kind of tell, oh, here's basically what's going on face to face. One of the things that happened over COVID, so much was digitally mediated that we could go years without actually knowing how the other person's doing, because you could just craft everything, right? When this goes too far, it creates an alternate reality where we're continually focused on the self. Always focused on ourselves. It's psychologically addicting because it's always pushing us, thinking about, what do you want? What do you want to be seen as? What do you want to talk about? What do you want to do? It's always pushing us towards self, 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 self. And that reality actually becomes fostered by companies who are competing for your attention. It actually becomes physiologically habit forming. And this is where we get into dystopia, just a little bit. Because the business model of personal digital technology is you are the product. Think about it. If you're not paying for Facebook, who's paying Facebook? The advertisers are paying Facebook for the privilege of trying to get at your attention. This is the business model of Facebook, to sell advertisements to try to grab your attention, or to sell off your data to big data farms who are gathering this information so they can do things in kind of a communal way, or can do even better targeted advertisements. Tristan Harris talks about this, who worked at Google. He talks about there are kind of three kind of steps to draw in your attention, to focus on this personalization. The first is that they try to interrupt you, right? They try to get you out of whatever you're thinking about. So this is where like notifications would come in, right? Then they try to stimulate you, either with some kind of sensory stimulation, like a pretty color picture, or an emotional stimulation. Tristan Harris talks about how the goal is always to get lower and lower on your brainstem in terms of your emotional reactions so that you react in the most intense emotional way possible. Because if it's a battle between your prefrontal cortex, where you're making discerning decisions, and your brainstem, where kind of the gut level reactions of emotions are coming from, brainstem's going to win every time. So Tristan Harris talks about it's a race down to the bottom of your brainstem. And then they try to keep you going so that you don't stop. Try to keep you in some way. That's where the news feed that just scrolls on into infinity, right? That's where that comes in. The Netflix CEO, this was before the pandemic, but the Netflix CEO was being interviewed at all these other streaming services were coming online, and he was being asked, what's your greatest competitor at Netflix? He said, sleep. That was his actual answer. Sleep. Now, I do believe personal digital technology can be redeemed. Right? I do believe there is redemption possible in the midst of this. But we have to be aware of these values and the grains that are coming with this personal technology that are shaping and forming us in the process. We've got to be aware of it. So here's what I want to encourage you and everybody watching online to do this week. Take a week and journal your personal digital technology use. What I mean by that is just record, how much time did I spend on this today? What did I do? How did it make me feel? You can do it online, you can do it in a journal, you can do it however you want to do it. It's probably easier online. Let me get on my phone, right? What I don't want to encourage us to do yet is change anything. Whatever you've been doing, just keep doing it for one more week. But just do it reflectively. Pay attention to how am I engaging with this? And extra credit if you can get down to the bottom of how do I see these values affecting the way I engage with this? Okay? So just pay attention. Let's just be reflective. Let's just pay attention to the ways that these values are at work on us. And then let's bring those into a discussion next week of, okay, my suspicion is that most of us will see something's fallen here. And how does that need to be redeemed? Hopefully what it brings us into is this question of personal digital technology isn't as much, am I doing bad things or good things on my phone? Am I spending too much time or too little time? But more of, how is this shaping me as a human being in ways that are in alignment with who God's made me to be and ways that aren't? Think of that book screen debate, right? There's probably going to be both in there, right? Let's just pay attention to that so that we can bring it back and next week focus on the ways, how can we foster flourishing in this? And how can we subvert the degradation of our persons that it is creating? Okay? Make sense? All right. Father, we thank you that there is good news here, that there is redemption, that you have caught up the things we make into your story, that there are things that we make that will make it into the new heavens and the new earth. We ask you to give us a preview of that now, to give us wisdom and discernment for how that future is breaking into now. And that you would give us this week a deeper awareness of how we are being shaped, how we are being formed, so that we might celebrate the good and confess and repent in the places that we need to. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Thank you, guys.